Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for our distinguished guests out here tonight. My name is Greg Ferris. I'm president of the Forney ISD Board of Trustees. I hereby call this Forney ISD Board of Trustees meeting to order. It is now 7:01 p.m., and I certify a quorum is present. And the meeting has been posted in the time and manner required by law. These monthly meetings are open to the public. Although those meetings are public, comments and questions from the audience will be confined to the time designated for citizens to address the board. Thank you for being with us. At this time, I'd like to call on Scott Regan to lead us in our invocation, and after that, we'll have our pledges. So please stand with me.
Heavenly Father, we bow before you tonight, servants to your kingdom. We ask your blessings upon our meeting tonight. Guide our thoughts and our conversations as we seek to do the business of our beloved district. In Jesus Christ's name I pray. Amen.
Thank you. Pledge with me. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Honor
the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible.
Thank you. You may be seated. At this time, we'll move on to item 4, which is a budget public hearing. Mr. John Chase will be our presenter. Once again, I'll call this into public hearing at 7:03 p.m. And we're here to have this presented. Mr. Chase, are you ready? Y'all set up? Okay. I now turn it over to Mr. John Chase, Chief Financial Officer, to give the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Ferris. As you know, this year's been a little bit of a challenge with our budget process. With the legislature meeting this year, the House Bill 3 legislation that just recently passed at the end of May has kind of necessitated some changes to the budget that we have incorporated that we will present to you tonight. But normally at this point in the year, we've had a couple of different 2 or 3 budget workshops. We've already adopted a salary schedule and so forth, and so we kind of had a short time frame because of the legislative changes that have taken place. And so we're here tonight basically to just share those changes with you and incorporate it into the budget. So just to start off with, we did have our first and only budget workshop this year at the beginning of April. We kind of just gave you a high-level overview of the budget process. Since that time, we have actually given you the budget document last week that had all of the pay raise information in it, as well as the other budget increases that we're asking for the current year. But just to start off with, the budget document. It's organized in four sections. We had the introductory section, which basically is about 15 pages. If you had looked that over, and that basically gave you the insight of pretty much what was included in the rest of the budget document. If you just read that, you pretty much know with a pretty good high-level summary of everything that's going on in the district. The second section, the organizational section, that just kind of has how our school district is organized. The accounting structure and the accounting information that we use internally to control our budget. Also had budget policies and the development process included in that section. And then really the heart of the budget document is in the financial section. There's a lot of statistical analysis in there. There's comparative data from 4 previous years, including the budget that we're presenting to you tonight was included in that section. And then finally in the information section, we had detailed information, historic data on property values, tax rates, tax collections, student enrollment, and staffing levels. So those are pretty much the sections that incorporated into that budget document that you had for review. And so just we discussed this in the past, but to start the development of our budget, we always start with enrollment because that drives how many teachers we need, how many students we're going to have, how many desks that we need at classroom space in the whole bit. It also determines how much state aid that we're going to get. So once we get a good estimate on enrollment, then we start determining how many teachers that we need, what kind of pay raises we can afford, and the other capital improvements and things like that we can afford to do for the district. And so as you know, the district does work with Templeton Demographics, our demographer, and they give us a enrollment projection every year. They update it every year, and it goes out for about a 10-year period. But just in the short term, for the next 5 years, they're projecting that we're going to grow on average about 5.7% a year. And so this next year, the budget was developed with an enrollment increase based on 755 students, and our state aid estimate was projected accordingly. So just to kind of look at this graphically, what this looks like in 2019, the fall of 2018, actually the fall of 2018, the current year that we just ended, we had 10,198 students, and that was as of October. And we grew some during the springtime, so I think we actually wound up the year about 10,300 students, somewhere in that neighborhood. But we are projecting, we had 11,133 this last year, and we ended up with about 11,300, somewhere in that neighborhood. So we are projecting 11,888 kids next year. And so in the next 5 years, they got us growing out to about 14,700 students. So just looking at property values for this year, we got a preliminary estimate from the chief appraiser in April, and that estimate initially we were growing in excess of about 20%. I think is what the initial estimate was. Since that time, we've had a fairly active protest period this year. And I think the last look that I got, we had about 15% of our property value under protest right now. We did take into account that we would lose about 7 or 8% of that value under protest when you see this 18.7% projected growth that we're predicting for this upcoming year. We won't know what that officially will be until we'll get our final certification in July. And so, you know, it's not uncommon even after that point to still have a little bit of value under protest, but at that point we should know pretty much what our values are. We feel like 17 or 18.7% is a reasonable estimate. It could be lower than that, but I'm feeling pretty good that that's probably what the values will be after the protest period ends. When you look at our values over the last 5 years, you know, of course, the most growth that we've seen is in our single-family residential properties. You don't have to drive very far in the district to see that. The reasons for that, we do have some commercial growth that's gone on over the last 5 years. We picked up, you know, almost $500 million there, and then in the other areas that we have divided out here is you know, we've had some modest growth in the rest of the areas, and we do have one area where we actually had a decline, and it's not really any surprise there. In our ag land, you know, as that land comes out of ag use and goes into single family residential, commercial, whatever they change that over to, it's not really any surprise that you know, that value is going down because it's moving into those other categories. So when we talk about our combined budget, the board, your responsibility for adopting a budget, the general fund, food service fund, and debt service fund comprises the three funds that make up our combined budget that you are responsible for approving tonight. The estimated revenue for these three budgets combined is $35.5 million, and the appropriations that we'll be presenting and asking for approval on is $126.1 million. Now, just the breakdown on how that all breaks down, the general fund, the estimated revenue is about almost $107 million. Food service funds, $4.4 million, and the debt service funds estimated revenue is $24.3 million. And the appropriations, you know, in the same order. The general fund is just over $100 million. Food service fund is $4.4 million, and the debt service fund is $21.3 million. And as a percent basis goes, the general fund, it makes up about 80% of the budget that you'll be approving tonight. The debt service fund, 17%, and the food service is just 3%. And so moving into the fund specifically, on the general fund side, as we just pointed out in the previous slide, it is the largest part of the budget that we'll be dealing with. The majority of the revenue sources that fund the general fund is, as you know, is property taxes and state aid. It's about 98% of the estimated revenue in that fund. And so, you know, there's very few other sources that we get through either interest income or, you know, collections from athletic events, or, you know, we get a little money from the federal sources, whether it's through E-rate reimbursements or Medicaid reimbursements that make up the other 2% of our budget. So it's primarily, we're talking about property taxes and state aid, as you know. And this year, our payroll budget's about 76% of that, of the total budget in general fund. It's usually a little higher than that. It's usually around 80%. We do have some money earmarked for capital projects, as we'll discuss a little later in the budget. If you strip that part of the budget out, you know, we're back up into that 80% range for the total budget as far as payroll goes. So it's pretty labor-intensive operation for a school district, and that's, you know, we're in the business of educating kids, so our resources are going to be driven into the payroll cost of the personnel that it takes to do that. So just moving into the revenue assumption for the general fund, just wanted to point out here that, you know, House Bill 3, as we discussed earlier, there's lots of changes in the state funding that goes along with that. Under the old school funding formula, the basic allotment, the amount we would get per kid basically was $51.40. It's moving to $61.60, so it's, you know, so quite a big swing. The guaranteed yield, which they often refer to that as it used to be tied to the Austin ISD's level of wealth. That was referred to as golden pennies. You might have heard that terminology in the past as well. They've kind of decoupled that from Austin ISD now, and it's based on, I believe, a percentile of wealth, like the 96th percentile or something like that. But it's 60, maybe 60% or 80% of the basic allotment or something like that. But it's not coupled to Austin ISD anymore. And then the guaranteed yield level 2, that's if you were to do a tax rate election, those pennies that you would levy above what's allowed by law without a tax rate election, we would be guaranteed you know, $49.28 per penny per student should we ever choose to do that in the future, which is significantly higher than what it is right now at $31.95. On the average daily attendance, as we talked about earlier, our enrollment increase, we're basing that on 755 students. Now, they don't actually pay you on enrollment. We're getting paid by the state through the days that kids actually attend school, and so historically, about 96% kids are at school about 96% of the time, and so you have to discount that 755 number back to 96%, which is that 725 number, and you add that to what our revised average daily attendance was at the end of this year, which was 10,606, to arrive at that 11,331 number is what we're estimating on average daily attendance for next year. We've talked about property values already, and it going up to 18.7% this next year. At least that's what our estimate is. We do have a pretty good tax collection history here. A lot of that has to do with a lot of our properties are escrowed when people buy homes. If they don't put a certain percent down, or even if they do put a certain percent down, a lot of times they'll be escrowed with an escrow agent, and so, you know, we don't have a lot of delinquencies because of that. And then the ones we the other properties that come out for ag was an ag, and then it gets switched over to either residential or commercial use. We have some pretty significant collections in ag rollbacks, which ends up pushing that collection percentage usually over 100% actually, but we're basing our revenue estimate on 100%. And so finally, on the tax rate side, if you'll notice there, currently our tax rate is $1.54. With House Bill 3, it's required that we compress our tax rate from $1.04 on the maintenance and operations side to 97 cents. And so by cutting the tax rate by 7 cents, that's where we're going to get our $1.47 should you choose to leave our INS rate at 50 cents, which is what we're proposing that we do. So just to kind of looking at that on a holistic basis here, we'll be getting almost 45% of our revenues, operating revenues in the general fund from local sources, 54% from state aid, and from federal sources just under 1%. And so when you look at it on a change basis, we're going to be getting about $3.4 million more in local tax collections primarily next year. And you'd think with our values going up 18%, is why isn't that number going up 18%? Well, it's because we're cutting our tax rate by 7 cents. And so that the percentage of revenue that we're going to collect, even at a higher increase in property values, it's not going to directly line up with our value increases like it normally has in the past years. On the state aid side, almost $19 million a change. There's a couple of reasons for that. It seems like a lot, and it is. But if you'll recall, we have an underpayment, pretty significant underpayment from the state this year, about $6.4 million. And so if you strip that part of it out, you're looking at about $12.5 million. $12.5 million, $5 or $6 million of that's probably new growth for the 755 students that are coming at us next year. And the rest of the increase is primarily due to funding increases because of House Bill 3. And so that pretty much wraps gives you a good idea of what our general operating revenues are. And again, I mentioned the federal revenues. I mean, that primarily what we get there is the biggest part of that $1 million that we get in federal sources is from Medicaid reimbursements. We do get a small amount for E-rate reimbursements as well to help us fund our some technology issues here in the district. Moving on to the expense side, we've got the pay raises this year. There's some requirements in House Bill 3. We do think what we're proposing here actually exceeds what the House bill requires. But just to kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about with teachers, the minimum pay raise would be $1,800. The maximum would be $3,300. And that averages out to, when you do it on an actual average, a weighted average basis, about 5.1% is what the teachers would average get. Now, some of them will actually obviously be less than 5% if they're on the 1,800 side of the range, and some of them are going to be quite a bit higher or a little higher than maybe 6% range on the ones that are getting $3,300. And so the teachers in the I would say the 7 or 8 year range up to about 30 years, they're all going to get about $3,300. The ones that are less than 4 years, I think they'll get $1,800, and the folks that are between 4 and 8 years, it's a graduated scale until you get up to the $3,300 range, and then finally the last group, the ones that have 33 years or more, they're going to be capped at $1,800. The teachers' aides, we're proposing a 5% raise in this budget. Custodians and food service workers, we're proposing a 9.1% pay increase off the midpoint. We feel like we've been having a lot of trouble trying to get custodians and food service workers, hiring them because of our pay scale. This would bring our minimum pay to $10 an hour on this scale. Once we bring it up to that, we feel like we can at least try to attract some folks and maybe hang on to them at that pay rate. And so that's why we're proposing a 9.1% pay increase for them. The grounds and the lead custodians, we're asking for a 5.5% increase for those guys. And then most other staff members, it would be 3% of midpoint. There are some staff members that we're doing market-based adjustments on, as well as changing responsibilities that would necessitate an increase slightly above that 3%. We are retaining the employee retention stipend as we have in the last 3 or 4 years. That's 1% of the pay grade midpoint. If you are an employee and you're with us prior to February 1st of this year, and you're still with us in November, then we'll be proposing to give them a 1% of pay grade midpoint adjustment or pay around Thanksgiving. And that for teachers, that's about $550 or somewhere in that neighborhood is what 1% of their midpoint would be. This budget does include increased staffing of 101 positions. As you know, last year we staffed on about 76, at least initially, and we had 935 additional students show up. So we were a little bit behind as far as keeping that staffing ratio on a 10-to-1 basis, and so that we came back this year and picked up some of those, is why that number is 101 now. Normally, it would be, somewhere around 80 staff members at this time, but we did, like I said, had to go back and pick up the ones that we didn't have in 2019 because of, our enrollment was so much more than what we had at least originally projected that it would be. We do, on our budgets for our campuses, we have a per student allotment. Those haven't changed from the previous year, although as their enrollment goes up at those campuses, the allotment that they receive goes up. We do have some money that's set aside, so if there's a significant amount of enrollment more than what we had originally proposed that they would have, we make those adjustments in October. Once we do that October snapshot, that's what we base it on. And so in October, we'll find out, how many students were over in certain pockets of our district, and we'll adjust their budgets accordingly based on these numbers. And if we've got any money left in that category, we may try to give these guys a little bit more than the 91, 81, and 86 or 68 that you see here. It just kind of depends on what our enrollment will look like in October once we finally decide, see what the final tally is. As far as maintenance project goes, as you're aware, this year we are re-roofing Criswell Elementary. We aren't proposing to do a roofing project next year at this time, but likely what will happen to this roofing project at Criswell, that $863,000, is they're not going to be through by the time Friday rolls around here, and that's when our fiscal year will end. And so the same thing that we did this past year, we'll be doing again this year, is probably in the July board meeting, all these construction projects and things that we've got going on that we haven't completed, that they're going to roll into the following year. We'll bring that budget amendment to you and reappropriate the funds that'll roll into fund balance from the previous year, and we'll reserve that fund balance in the audit schedule, so it'll show up as designated for capital improvements or something like that. I think assignments is what the actual audit terminology is, but we'll assign that fund balance for those projects and bring it back to you for reappropriation probably in July, like I said. We do have money in there for same amount or a little less, slightly less for fire panels, security cameras, and security equipment. We have that line item again for this coming year. We still have money in there for buses. The other improvements category, we've got $6.9 million set aside for projects that will be prioritized and bringing to you at a future date, but that money is sitting there for those projects. And then finally, down in the student technology area, we've talked a lot about this, but just want to keep this on everyone's mind that we just completed our Chromebook lease for the next 3 years for the new batch of Chromebooks we bought this spring. Our payment next year for those is $78,000, excuse me, and we're still making our payments on the wireless network infrastructure upgrades that we did about 5 years ago, I think it was. We have, I think, two more payments after this coming year, and I believe the two payments that we have left are actually half of what you're seeing there right now. But we got a couple more years left to pay on it, and then it may probably be time for us to look at maybe doing something, kind of a refresh in our wireless network at that point. But just kind of want to keep that in the forefront and just let you know that technology is one of those things that you pretty much have to budget and stay on top of all the time, or else you get so far behind it's not even worth using. And then finally, on the fund balance section of the general fund, we are projecting our budgeting a surplus of $4.6 million, and that's about what we're projecting that the state aid underpayment is for this year. And we're doing that for a reason, because we have a budget deficit this year of slightly more than that, but that amount will basically clear up the budget deficit that we have this year because of that lag and that underpayment from the time that we're going to get it. We can't recognize it this year because it's going to be collected 60 days after the fiscal year ends, but that's what that represents. And at the end of the 2020 year, we'll still have around 3 months of operating expenses. So just kind of looking at this is the budget on the expense side. As you're well, you have to approve the budget in the functional categories, and that's what you see presented here. Just the revenues, like I said, was $106.8 million, or they're up 26.6%. The expenditures are just over 100 million, and they're up 6.9%. And I said, as I said, you know, down here, this area, it shows that, you know, our budget surplus is 6.4 million. So just to kind of wrap up the general fund, to summarize, as I just pointed out, the estimated revenue is up 26.6, expenditures are 6.9. That does include a pay increase for staff based on the employee classification of a range between 3 and 9.1%. There is $6.9 million set aside for capital improvements. We are having that budget surplus, like I pointed out, for the state aid underpayment. We will have 3 months of operating expenses by the time 2020 year end rolls around, and that's at a tax rate of 97 cents. On food service, this is a pretty straightforward. Both the estimated revenue and appropriations are increasing 9.2%. This fund just, you know, it accounts for the district's food service operation of the district, and so, you know, primarily what we get our money here for is either through collections for lunch sales or through federal reimbursements for free and reduced lunches. So the 9.2% basically represents increases either in inflation or student growth is primarily what that's all about. Plus, we did go up a dime on the lunch prices. And so when you look at the food service expenditure side of the equation, the payroll's up 13.3%. A lot of that has to do with the 9% pay increase, but we did put on a few extra food service staff to help with the additional campus size at the 2 intermediate schools. But other than that, you know, you have some inflationary growth and student growth that would necessitate supplies and the other things that is involved in the food service operation to get that at 9.2% increase as well. So on the debt service fund, this is kind of the last fund that you'll be approving tonight. This does account for our principal and interest and related fees for all bonded debt that we take on for capital improvements here in the district. 100% of the revenues in this fund is coming from property taxes or interest income. We used to get some money for state aid, but I'm projecting this year that if we get anything, it's going to be very little through the EDA and IFA program. So the existing debt allotment and instructional facilities allotments is what those initials stand for. But I'm not. We don't have anything in the budget for state aid for debt services this current year. And if we do get something, it's going to be minimal. It all depends on where they set the debts, the existing debt allotment or the existing debt allotment threshold, because it used to be $35 per penny per pupil. In this last legislative session, they appropriated some additional funds, saying they were going to fund it up to $40 if they could do it with the appropriation they made. And then it turns out, you know, the appropriation would only fund up like $37 or a little over that. So it basically is going to be contingent upon that appropriation and how much above the $35 threshold they can go. And so it's possible we could get some funds, but it's not. I'm not projecting that we will. And so the food service or the debt service revenues are up 16.7%. And again, you would think that would be 18.7 because of tax collections, but since we're not going to get any state program revenues, that part's getting cut out, so it's slightly below that 18% mark. On the expenditure side, they're up 13.6. One of the reasons why they're up that much is, as you'll recall, back in the fall when we set the tax rate at 50 cents, we called some debt, like I think it was 2.4 million or so, and that payment will not be made until August, when that debt service is actually callable. So that money rolled into fund balance and for this last year, and we'll be making that principal payment to clear that debt off our books in August 15th, which is about a month and a half away. But that being said, we are still going to generate a surplus in the debt service account for a tax rate at 50 cents, and so we're going to identify what capital appreciation bonds or any other bonded debt that might make sense for us to defease with those additional tax collections at 50 cents, and we'll be presenting that to you in the September board meeting for your consideration and approval. So again, like I said, just to summarize, we are going to be recommending a tax rate of 50 cents in the debt service fund. We will have surpluses because of the timing of that debt service payment. One of the things that you'll notice when you look at on this last screen here, or the prior screen, is that why are we carrying 18 million or $20 million in fund balance in the debt service fund? Well, because we're a July 1 fiscal start, and we're levying a tax in October, and we're collecting all that tax in October to make the principal and interest payment for February and the following February and August. When the fiscal year ends in June, on June 30, we still have a pretty significant principal payment that we have to make 45 days later after the fiscal year ends. So we have to carry a fund balance in order to make that debt service payment. It is part of the reason for that. And the other part is we're generating a surplus to pay off callable cabs and other debt. So getting back to it, our fund balance expected at 2020 is 24 million, and our August debt service payment in 2020 is 13.4. So you could subtract 13.4 off that 24, and that would give you an idea of how much really surplus that we have in that fund when it's all said and done. So just to kind of wrap up, we'll receive our certified tax roll on July 25th. We can't adopt a tax rate until we get that final certification, and so once we get that, we actually this year in the publication that I put in the newspaper, it actually had our proposed tax rate at that time. You are legally allowed to go below what was posted in the paper. So if you choose to go below 50 cents, you can. But that's what we posted in the tax notice section of that notice that was in the paper that ran a couple of weeks ago. But once we get that certification, we're going to have a hearing about what the tax rate is, and discuss what the impact is on an average house in the district on September 9th. And at that point, that you guys would be ready to adopt whatever tax rate that you choose to set. So that's kind of what we have left as far as the budget goes. If there's any questions about any of the specifics that was in the budget document, I'll be happy to answer those at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chase. Do we have any questions from the board?
I don't specifically, but it seems like I've seen they have published the rates, and I know Tommy probably has them, but it seems like the employee family rate was going up $30 or so, if I remember right, a month. And I don't know about individual, but do you remember what that? Yeah,
Was it a huge expense increase?
3 or 4% maybe.
Noticeable?
It's at least 3 or 4% if I remember right, but I can get you that information and share.
I'm curious, like raises, how much that, I know it's just years when we gave raises and
Right, and it will eat into some of that. I mean, that is true, but for the teacher getting $3,300 for the year, they should see a pretty good increase on their paycheck for the month.
So just to clarify what I heard you guys saying, this is not a significant insurance increase year so far?
I don't believe so, Mr. Ferris.
Because I was thinking last year it was like a 13 or 15% increase.
I didn't think it was that significant this year.
Okay.
But I'll get the data for you and send it out to you so
Okay.
you'll have it.
Any other questions from the board?
Just one, and this is more legislative. This ADA allotment of the 6160, before there was a big difference between districts. Is this more standardized, or is every district getting a different number?
So I'm glad you brought that up. So there's a lot to unpack with that House Bill 3. I mean, I've just kind of I blushed over it here in the presentation, but funding lag because of property values, you know, and that has some variability of what districts would have on an operating basis. And now that everybody's going to have to use current values, that property value lag is not going to be an issue in the formula anymore. So it's going to be, everybody's going to be pretty much on the same footing in that regard. Also, they used to have what they called the cost of education index, that each district was assigned a percentage, I think about 20 years ago, and based on that percent, they would take your basic allotment and increase it by whatever cost of education index that you were assigned. So the idea is that based on geography, it's more or less expensive to operate a school district in certain parts of the state. So like in this major metropolitan areas, you know, trying to compete with you know, for teachers and things like that, sometimes it's a little more expensive than when you get out in some of the other parts of the state. And so that was what the idea was. The problem with that is that Forney ISD, back when they assigned that rate, you know, we were kind of pretty much more of a rural type district at that point. And our cost of education index that we were assigned was like 8%. So we got an 8% adjustment on that rate. Well, a Rockwall and a Mesquite were at 13%. And so basically, since they did not commission another study to try to make that current, they just stripped that cost of education index out of the formula. So in that regard, people are going to be more on an equal footing for that as well. The last two things I would point to on the funding formula is, and one of the reasons why we do have a pretty significant amount in capital improvement projects in the budget is there's two allotments in the formula now. One is fast growth, and if you're in the top quartile of growing districts in the state, then they give you a special allotment for that. And obviously, Forney is in the top quartile, and so you know we're going to get a couple $1 million out of that allotment. And then the other section of the formula, they call it transition aid, and because if you were to run the formula as it currently exists with next year's ADA and all the other FTEs and things like that to go in the formula to determine state aid, we weren't even going to get a 3% increase in aid because of the whole property value lag and a whole bunch of things like that. So what they basically wrote into the law is that you were guaranteed at least a 3% increase. And so in order to do that, we got transition assistance that amounts to a little over $3 million. And so between the fast growth allotment and the transition assistance, we got about a little over $5 million there that other districts aren't getting. And so in that regard, we are a little better off in that case, but you know, those won't last forever. I mean, you know, we'll be a fast growth district for a while, but not forever. And I don't, they said that transition assistance, you know, they're saying that will go away in 2024. We'll see if that happens. I mean, that's 2 legislative cycles away. But for the most part, other than those parts of the formula, most people are going to be on an equal footing, yes. There are, you know, if you were just to take the average rate of attendance and divide by state and local revenue, you're going to get some variability there, partly because, you know, some districts have a lot more kids that are on free and reduced lunch, which means that they probably got a lot more money that they got for compensatory ed purposes. And you know, maybe one district has more special ed kids than another. I mean, there's some variations there because of the types of populations that you have, but for the most part, we're all going to be on equal footing, yes.
Okay, thank you.
I've got those rates, if you want some information on that.
That'd be great.
For employee only, the active care 1 HD, the rates are going up $11 a month, $367 to $378. That's for the state's contribution or Forney ISD's contribution. But basically, the increase is $11 a month for employee only. If it was employee and children, it's going up $21 a month. So there's a sample there. If it's just employee and spouse, it looks like it's going $31 a month. Now the Active Care 2 plan, which is really being phased out, employee only on that is going up, it looks like $70 per month. We don't have very many people paying for that level of insurance. And employee and children on that is going up about $104 on the Active Care.
The state is really trying to transition districts out of that active care too. I mean, they're trying to basically more or less push us all into that high deductible type insurance. So, I mean, they're pricing it to a point that nobody can afford it, is what it amounts to. So, I mean, like what I do, on that high deductible plan is that by participating in that, you're also eligible to put money into a HSA, a health savings account, which is different than a flexible spending account. A flexible spending account is one of those deals where you put money into it, and if you don't use it by the end of the year, you just lose it. But on a health savings account, if you're in a high deductible plan, you can put money into that savings account, and at the end of the year, if you don't use it, it just rolls over to the next year, and you never lose it. So that's what I kind of do to try to help cover deductibles and other things for my family. But when you get to high deductible insurance, I mean, it's basically a catastrophic plan at that point, because it really doesn't cover a whole lot. I mean, it doesn't cover your hospital visits. I mean, not in the hospital, excuse me, your doctor visits and things like that until you're out of pocket like $5,000 for a family or something. So it's not great, but I think the push is everybody's kind of pushing people more towards that direction these days in the whole industry, really.
I was just curious because like I said, I know in previous years it was significant, and so you kind of want to balance what your raise is against
Mm-hmm.
how much that's going up. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you for that information. Any other board members have a question? We have no further questions at this time, then we'll allow for comments from the public. Anybody in our audience out there have a question? And I hear none. So at this time, we'll close our public hearing, and we'll then continue on and reconvene into a regular board meeting now at 7:43 p.m. Moving on then to public forum. I don't believe anybody signed up to address the board. Moving on to item 6, reports. Next reports require no action from the board. First will be Mr. Chase, our monthly financial report.
So the activity for the month of May is presented for your review. The revenues that we recognized for the month was $2.4 million. The expenditures for the month was $7.7 million. Year-to-date revenue was $71.5 million, or 83% of the amount estimated, and I believe last year at this time we were at 82%. Year-to-date expenditures is $81.8 million, or 87% of the amount appropriated, which I think last year at this time we were right at 89%, so we're real close to where we expect at this time of year. As far as the debt service fund, I mean, there's really not a lot to report here. Again, we've last few times after you make that February debt service payment, it's pretty much just tax collections from here on in. We did get $129,000 in tax collections for May. Again, we had no expenditures. The total revenues for the year up to this point is $21 million, or right at 101% of the amount that we estimated. The expenses are $18.7 million, or 100% of the amount appropriated. So again, we're pretty much through with the activity, have been in the debt service fund for the last 2 or 3 months. As far as the cash and investments on hand, when you combine the general fund, food service, debt service, capital project funds, we've got $72.6 million either in investment pools or on deposit at Citibank. So a lot of that, $22 million of that is capital projects. So we're in the middle of adding on to finishing up Ray and Smith and adding on to the other 4 elementaries that we're adding on to. So that's why we're carrying a pretty large cash reserve right now for capital projects. And the debt service amount that we've got listed there, as we've talked about in our budget workshop, we'll be drawing that pretty far down, in August of August 15th, when we make our principal interest and defease those callable bonds that we've got on schedule to defease. So that's the financial report. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Any questions? Thank you, Mr. Chase. This time we'll move on to item 7, our consent agenda. The board may take action on each separately or collectively. Do I have a motion and a second? 7A does cover approval of minutes from May 28th, 7B, approve Cisco ISD purchase, and C, approve the Life Anew purchase. Can I have a motion and any board members?
Mr. Ferris, I move we approve the consent agenda collectively.
Mr. Johnson makes a motion we approve 7A, B, and C collectively. Have a second?
Second.
Ready?
Thank you, Mr. Regan. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And it is approved. Thank you very much. Moving on to item 8, consideration and possible approval of the 2018-19 budget amendments. Mr. John Chase, would you please share those with us at this time?
Yeah, normally, we have the budget amendment on consent, but since it's the last budget amendment of the year, I like to wait till we get all the payroll wrapped up, which we did last week, and it was after the board book was published, and get all the things associated with the payroll posted up, so we can kind of look at where we're at for the year. Because sometimes there's reasons that we need to make some final adjustments to the budget, and there are some tonight. But just on the revenue side, we're increasing our local revenue for higher than expected property tax collections and interest income. We're raising that estimate at $560,000. On the state side, we're actually decreasing our state revenue estimate by $945,000, and that's attributed to the state aid underpayment. You know, we already had planned on about $2 million of that already in the budget. There's another $900,000 or so to add to that. I mean, we are going to get 6.4, but if you'll remember, the budget was actually built on like a 600 student increase. So that's why we never adjusted the revenues for that change. But anyway, we're decreasing our revenue estimate by $945,000 for state. And then on the federal side, we've got a slight increase there for higher than expected E-rate and Medicaid reimbursements. So a total adjustment to the revenue estimated revenue would be just under $300,000. On the debt service side, we're adjusting the budget, the library and media services, $20,000 increase, and that was and also transportation, $190,000. And those were increases in payroll costs that were a little more than originally estimated. You know, we have some things that we need to post at the end of the year as far as things that the state pay on our behalf towards teacher retirement. You know, there's some adjustments that we have to post into the books for audit purposes that we have not gotten all the information on. So, you know, some of those changes in those two functions are based on, you know, estimating what those might be, but we did have some little higher costs in those two functions, more than we originally planned on at the beginning of the year. We had some surplus in the operations budget payroll for maintenance and operations, primarily for positions that we couldn't fill during the year. You know, part of it I think was because of the pay that we were paying. Hopefully, this $10 an hour minimum that we were proposing in the comp plan will help us with that in the future. But we had some surplus there that we could transfer into those two line items, and the bottom line, the total appropriations isn't changing. It's just changing functions. There are no changes to our other financing sources and uses. What we did change the budget for that during the year was that was directly related to the Chromebook lease proceeds that we were collecting. Plus, we did a short-term loan to the capital project funds in the previous year in anticipation of getting those bonds sold for those 4 elementary school additions that we were doing this year. And so once we had some costs that we had to recognize in fiscal 2018. Now, after we sold the bonds and got the proceeds in the bank, you know, we had that resolution that we approved to allow us to reimburse ourselves. So that's what about 600 of that $1.9 million that was. They've already been previously approved amendments, but I'll just explain to you what that was all about. And then, so finally, our budget deficit for the year is it's going to $6.7 million. We've talked in the board books in the past about what that represents. Just to keep in mind that we did have $6.4 million of underpayments that we were going to get in the next fiscal year, that had we have received that when we actually had the student enrollment to earn it, and could recognize it against the expenses that we had for the current year, our budget deficit would be much different. But we're going to pick that up the following year, and it's going to bring our fund balance back into where it needs to be. But it's just it's an accounting issue that we have to deal with. But of that $7.6 million deficit, $2.8 million of it was projects that were budgeted the prior fiscal year, but we had to roll the funding over for the current year because we didn't complete them until after July of 2018. And then we had $2.9 million earmarked for additional costs associated with the renovations and additions to the elementary schools. That was over and above what we had capital project funding to cover. And then finally, we had that land purchase that we did that we partially funded with capital project funds, and we partially funded out of the general fund. So that's the budget amendment. My recommendation is that you approve it as presented.
Thank you, Mr. Chase. Do you have any questions from the board? I'd just like to say thank you for the bullet points and the clarity of all that. It makes it very easy to understand. Dr. Terry, do you have a recommendation?
Yes, sir. I concur with Mr. Chase that we approve these amendments as presented. Close out this year. It's been a good year.
Thank you very much. You've heard the presentation and Dr. Terry's recommendation. Do I have a motion from the board?
Mr. Ferris, I make a motion to approve the budget amendment as presented.
Thank you, Mr. Carroll. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And I hear none. Thank you very much. Moving on to item 9, consideration and possible approval of the 2019-2020 budget. Mr. Chase will present this.
So we've just pretty much during the budget hearing have gone through all this, so I'm not going to go through all over again. But essentially, what we're asking you to approve is a proposed budget with all the consideration that we discussed in the budget workshop or the budget hearing. But essentially, the total budget is the estimated revenue is $135.5 million on a combined basis, and the total expenses our total appropriations will be $126.1 million, with a combined total fund balance surplus of $9.4 million. The way that breaks out again, the $6.4 million surplus in the general fund and another $3 million surplus in the debt service fund. So this is your budget, broken out by functional categories that you're required to approve by state law, and this is our recommendation, and be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chase. Do you have any questions from the board? I hear none. Dr. Terry, what's your recommendation?
Mr. Ferris, if it's okay, I'd just take a second, just commend Mr. Chase. If you guys did see when House Bill 3 was approved, he's been under a very tight schedule this year, and so he's worked a lot of long hours to get this done in about a week and a half, and just done an incredible job. And if you don't mind, I'll just point out a few bullet points that we're really excited about within this budget. Number one, safety and security is continuing to be a priority. $750,000 to $1 million, again, appropriated to that. We were able to, within this budget, increase pay 3 to 9% for all employees, as well as maintain that 1% retention, which is great for our staff and their families. We're able to also allot money towards future projects, and we've still got some needs throughout the district that we'll discuss, and we're able to do that all with a lowering of the tax rate. And I just wanted to point that out again, that you're going to see a compressed tax rate recommended 7 cents less, from $1.54 to $1.47 in August. And I'd also like to point out that even with an election that was called, a bond election, if that does go through, that tax rate would remain lower at that $1.47, even through sale of bonds. So that's pretty exciting news. We're very healthy right now. We're sitting with a projected over $25 million in fund balance again this year, over 3 months of operating expense. So I am excited about what House Bill 3 did for us, even more excited to present a very healthy budget to you guys for approval tonight. And thanks again to Mr. Chase and his team. They've just done an incredible job. So my recommendation is wholeheartedly to approve this budget.
Thank you, Dr. Terry. You've heard the presentation and recommendation from administration. May I have a motion?
Mr. Ferris, I make a motion to approve the 2019-2020 budget as presented.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. May I have a second?
Second.
Mr. Johnson, thank you very much. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And I hear none. So it is approved. Thank you, Mr. Chase, and all your hard work and interpretations that you've been taking care of. So thank you very much. Moving on then to item 10, I think Mr. Chase will be up again. Consideration and possible approval for the 2019-2020 employee compensation plan.
So the compensation plan was included in that budget book, as well as I think the plan was again presented in this item in your budget packet. But essentially, what we're presenting here, we've changed, retitled some positions and changed pay grade on a few positions. Primarily the pay bands. I mean, just real quick, most of the midpoints have been shifted by 2%, with the exception of custodial and food service. We moved those about 8 or 9%. I think is what we moved the midpoint on that to get to where the minimum pay was at $10 an hour. We did shift the pay range for teachers' aides by 4%, which is a little outside the 2% range as well. But for the most part, everybody else's pay range got adjusted about 2%. That's what you have in front of you tonight. The teacher salary schedule that you also have included is, I believe the minimum pay went up about $1,600. I think we were at $50,000 last year. If you have no years of experience, you'll be making $51,600 this year. Most of the pay ranges from that point on got adjusted by about somewhere in that $1,600 range, based on experience. But for the most part, as we pointed out earlier, as a teacher, you're going to see $1,800 to $3,300 increase on an annual basis. So that's the compensation plan that we've presented to you. If you have any questions about it, we'll try to answer them.
Thank you, Mr. Chase. You've all seen the compensation plan. Are there any further questions from the board? I hear none. Dr. Terry, what is your recommendation?
Thank you, Mr. Ferris. We continue to try and stay market competitive, and we're doing our best to continue to recommend comp plans that stay within our budget, but do that. And I think this one is continuing to move us towards a very market competitive compensation plan for our employees. So recommend our comp plan as presented.
Thank you, Dr. Terry. May I have a motion?
Mr. Ferris, I'll make a motion to approve the 2019-20 teacher or employee compensation plan as presented.
Second.
Thank you. May I have a second, Ms. Green?
Yes.
Thank you very much. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
And so it is approved. Moving on to item 11, consideration and possible approval for annual board goals. Dr. Terry will be our presenter.
Thank you, Mr. Ferris. I'll be brief on this. In 2014, as a reminder, we went through a forward-focused process with our community that represented or ended up putting out 6 board goals that were recommended and approved in 2014 and 2017. We revisited that plan and came up with our new vision for the district, mission for the district, which included Forney Focus 2.0, and we're continuing to move towards those board goals. In 2020, in the spring, we will come back to a strategic planning process and revisit those board goals. However, in the meantime, we've still got some work to do, and these 6 board goals, in our opinion, are serving us well for this coming school year, so we would recommend no changes and that you adopt again the 6 board goals that we've been working under that were presented to you within your board book.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the board? I hear none. Dr. Terry, do you have a recommendation?
I do. I would recommend, again, that we adopt our same board goals and stay consistent with those as we continue to move forward through the 1920 school year.
Thank you very much. May I have a motion, please?
Mr. Ferris, I move that the board adopt the goals as presented and recommended by the administration.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. May I have a second?
Second.
Mr. Regan?
Yes, sir.
I have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And I hear none. Thank you very much. Moving on to item 12, consideration and possible approval of the design schematic and budget for new campuses. Ms. Judy Weber, Chief of Learner Services, will be your presenter.
Mr. Ferris, school board members, as we discussed earlier in our workshop tonight, we're proposing a design schematic and a budget of $102 million for a new middle school and a new intermediate school.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the board? As she mentioned, we did have workshop over this, and you've presented all the information. So, Dr. Terry, what is your recommendation?
Yes, sir. Just to remind you, this is an early phase, but we do want to go ahead and recommend approval of the schematic to continue to move forward in that process and the design process, as well as going ahead and setting a $102 million budget for us to design under.
Thank you very much. May I have a motion?
I move to approve the design schematic and budget as presented.
Thank you, Ms. Green. May I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And I hear none. Thank you very much. Moving on to item 13, consideration and possible approval of the 2019-2020 TASB delegate and alternate selection. At this time, we will always give one of you the opportunity to serve. I think that some of you had that opportunity in the past, but at this time, I'd like to ask for a motion of nominations and a delegate.
Mr. Ferris, I would nominate that the board approve Heath Carroll as the delegate and Scott Regan as the alternate to serve at the 2019 TASB delegate assembly.
Mr. Johnson's made a motion that Mr. Carroll be the delegate and Mr. Regan be the alternate. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Dobbs. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
And do you guys agree to serve? I guess I should have asked that.
I'm gonna vote no, but yeah,
Okay. So, no, it's 100% unanimous. We're not going to give you a chance to say no. Okay. Moving on then to item 14, or before that, Ms. Tier, would you please register Mr. Carroll and Mr. Regan for that? Okay, I appreciate you take care of that for us. Moving on to item 14 is closed session. We'll move into closed session to pursuant Texas Government Code selections 551.074 and 551.0821. No voting will take place in closed session. Any action on this board wishes to take will result in discussions in closed session will take place after the board reconvenes into open. It is now 8:04 p.m. as we adjourn to closed session. Are we going upstairs or your office? If you would, meet us back in Dr. Terry's office.